Sunday school leader. Hey, we're looking at the lesson for September 22nd. That means we're only 3 months and 3 days away from Christmas. That is crazy to think about, isn't it? All right, what do we got coming up? We're in the unit that's entitled Simplicity, Finding Contentment in a Busy Life. This is lesson number 4. It's called Godly Contentment, out of 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 11 and 17 through 19. And the point of the lesson is that godliness with contentment is great gain. So this is a continuation of last week's lesson as we talked about contentment, but we're in a different book, same author though. We're looking at the Apostle Paul and another letter that he's written. And to fully understand what Paul is talking about here in our lesson text this week, I think we have to look back to the previous verses. We look back in verses 3 through 5, and we see that Paul is warning Timothy about those false teachers who imagine that godliness, and when I say godliness, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, that godliness is a means to gain. Or, if you just want to put it in layman's terms, they're preachers who are in it for the money. I just finished a book a few days ago called Primal by Mark Batterson. Really a good book. Tries to encourage us to get back to the basics, the essence of what it means to be a Christian or to practicing Christianity. And one of the quotes he has so many quotes in there that are just tweetable quotes. And one of them is that the problem with the prosperity gospel is that anytime you put an adjective in front of the word gospel, you distort the gospel. So in verses 3 through 5, Paul is talking about those false teachers who are in it for the money. And that's why in verse 6, Paul starts off and he says, but godliness with contentment, not greed, but contentment is great gain. Okay, the false teachers, they were looking for this godliness, this outward appearance that would give them, that would be a means for money, a means for income. But Paul says godliness with being content is great gain. Now, here's the thing. Certainly congregations are to take care of their ministers. All right, and as a minister, I wholeheartedly agree with that. The attitude that some people have, and I've heard this, not in this church, but in other churches, it's kind of that Bubba mentality. Well, it's our job to keep the pastors humble, so we're not going to pay them much. Well, that's a terrible attitude to have. In fact, in the earlier chapter, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 through 18, Paul says, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of honor, or double honor, especially those who are whose work of preaching and teaching, for Scripture says, don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. So definitely, pastors, don't be in it for the money, but congregations, take care of your pastors. All right, so there's a good balance there. So what is godliness? Well, it's not just an outward appearance, right? Jesus talks a lot about that, about the outside of the cup looking clean, but the inside is nasty. It's not just an outward appearance, but it's also an inward devotion, and it's a devotion that leads people to action. Okay, so that devotion is just not the warm fuzzies that I have, that I've sung a hymn or a praise chorus and I feel all good and fuzzy about Jesus. It's not that, but it's a faith. It's a faith that expresses itself through deeds. Right? The book of James talks a whole lot about that. That's why I think if Paul were writing this today, he would put those quotation marks around that word godliness when he was referring to those false teachers. That they had this outward appearance, all right, but their inward devotion was to self and to greed, not to good deeds. Now, as Paul continues here in our text this week, he's not teaching any new doctrine. In fact, he's bringing together several thoughts throughout Scripture, scriptural teachings about money. So Paul continues. He says, hey, we brought nothing into this world. We're going to take nothing out of it. And the excavation of the Pharaoh tombs in Egypt taught us that, didn't it? They buried the pharaohs with all this stuff they could use in the afterlife. And that stuff is still there, as well as the Pharaoh's bodies. In verse 8, Paul continues, and he says, if we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. Interesting. Our first lesson in this series dealt with that out of Matthew chapter 6. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount says, don't worry about food or clothing. Okay, so if we just have those basic necessities, Paul says, we'll be content with that. And then in verse 9, those who want to get rich fall into temptation. Now, I believe Paul, in these series of verses here, he's talking specifically to ministers. But now, of course, generally that can be applied to all folks. But as a minister, okay, if I'm in it for the money, I'm going to tend to cater to those people who give, especially the big givers. And if they start withholding money because of something I'm preaching on, if it's one of those hard-hitting subjects, I'm stepping on some toes, and that kind of ticks off some people, and they start withholding money, then I'll tend to soften that message or not preach that message or not preach the whole truth. So to me, that's what Paul is addressing here. Of course, we can look in James chapter 2 and see what James says for more information about catering to rich folks. All right, on in our text in verse 10, another misquoted verse here. It's not money that's the root of all evils or all kinds of evil, but it's the love of it. It's the love of money that's the root of all kinds of evils. And then down in verse 11, but you, man of God, okay, here's the contrast. Here's all these things you want to avoid, but you, Timothy, man of God, flee from all this. In contrast to the false teachers who are in it for the money, you, Timothy, flee this. And then what are you supposed to do instead? Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. So I believe that the verses we just covered, like I said earlier, are primarily dealing with pastors. But down in our next set of verses, down in verses 17 through 19, Paul encourages Timothy about dealing with people who are under his care, his congregants, we might say in this time. So in verse 17, he says, for those rich folks to whom you minister to, he calls them rich in this present age, meaning they're rich now, okay, but maybe not eternally rich, okay? Now, to those folks, command them. He said, he didn't say encourage them. He didn't say nudge them. He says command them not to do a couple of things. First of all, do not be arrogant. Don't go around with your nose in the air thinking that you're better. We go back to Proverbs 22:2 that says, rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. He also says, command them not to put their trust in riches, but to put their trust in God. What does Proverbs 11:28 say? Those who trust in their riches will fail, but the righteous will thrive like a green leaf. Okay, so don't do these couple things, but do this. What does he say to do? Be rich in good works. Be generous. Be ready to share. I'm not going to read these to you, but you can look these up. Proverbs 11:24 and 25, Proverbs 21:13, and Proverbs 22:9 all address this. And what happens when you do these things? Well, you store up, as Paul said, you'll store up eternal treasure. There again, back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. Don't lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, all that. So, in these verses here, is this a command to be poor? Is this a command to, if you're rich, to get rid of it because it's awful? No, it's not. Having money is neither sinful, nor is it a sign that God is smiling on you. Okay, that's the two extremes that people might take. And it's neither one of those, but it's the love of it. It's even the desire to have more of it that can be a trap, all right? Especially for ministers, okay, because we are called to a higher standard. All right, next week we're taking a trip back to Mayberry. Actually, we're going back to Exodus chapters 20 and 31, looking at a slower pace. So don't forget to pray for your class. I appreciate you guys very much.